Canada, founded in 1867, has become one of the oldest democracies on the planet. Its legal authority comes from constitutional convention, in the same vein as that of the UK. Conventions are dynamic legal codes that evolve over time. However, in Canada, authority is always seen as derived from the Crown. Max Weber spoke of this type of governance, and in his view, the state was always the center of decision-making. Over the past several decades, Weber's views have come under criticism, and new theories about governance are emerging. Networks and supranational organizations are now thought to be important players in governance, not simply the Crown. New ideas about governance can be summed up as such. Governance signifies a change in the meaning of government, referring to a process of governing, or a change in condition of ordered rule, or the new method by which society is governed. Rhodes, 1996. Governance theory promotes the idea that governance is not simply a top-down relationship, but that it involves networks of self-governing actors. To understand this idea, let's look at the relationship between the World Trade Organization and Canada as a case study. The WTO webpage states that the WTO is a place for trading, a place for negotiating trade agreements. Essentially, the WTO is a place where member governments try to sort out the trade problems they face with one another. The dispute settlement process is key to understanding the new forms of governance. Canada has had 21 disputes filed against it from member states. In 11 cases, the WTO ruled against Canada. In one case, it ruled in Canada's favor. 2 cases were settled without the WTO mechanism. 4 have to do with Brazilian airplanes. 2 are still in process, and 1 was simply a technicality. Of the 11 that were ruled against Canada, they can be broken down into 6 different categories: culture, content, supply, protection, patents, and Brazil. The first dispute against Canada came from the United States in regards to split-run news magazines. Canada had a huge import tax on foreign media to protect Canadian culture. The WTO ruled in favor of the US, and after some considerable negotiations, Canada gave up its tax and allowed the US into the domestic market. Sheila Copps, the Heritage Minister, although an adamant protector of Canadian culture, announced that Canada is implementing every word of the World Trade Organization decision on magazines. The tariff code measure will be eliminated, the excess tax measure will be eliminated. Another notable dispute came from Japan and the European communities. In these disputes, 2 Canadian content laws were challenged: the Autopack and Ontario's FIT program. Each program had an element that required a certain level of Canadian content for firms and states to be eligible for subsidies. And in each case, the WTO ruled against Canadian policy. In response to the ruling, and although there was domestic support for the programs, Canada scrapped both policies. In another case, the US filed a dispute against Canada's milk program. Canada has a milk supply system which included some subsidy to commercially exported milk. This program was managed by the provinces, but after the WTO ruled against the program, even the provinces had to change their legislation. The remaining disputes regarding transportation, grain, pharmaceuticals, and steel were all ruled against Canada, and Canada followed the WTO recommendation every time and changed its domestic law to follow the trade agreement. Canadian Minister of Industry, Brian Tobin, went as far as saying, "Canada always seeks to be in compliance with WTO rulings." The one exception to the WTO compliance rule is Quebec's aviation industry. Brazil has filed no less than 4 disputes regarding the industry, and the WTO has ruled against Canada in this regard. But instead of changing the domestic law, Canadian politicians have accepted countermeasures of up to $240 million from Brazil, instead of eliminating the subsidy to Quebec. It is not as though Canadian politicians reject the WTO authority in this matter, but because of the political nature of the issue, it is cheaper for them to pay Brazil in countermeasures rather than lose Quebec's votes. What does this all mean for Canada? The case study suggests that Canada cannot and does not act unilaterally when it comes to trade. Although authority in a strict sense still derives from the Crown, Canada has been governed by the WTO and the dispute settlement body. Canada is part of the WTO's self-governing network and submits itself to the WTO's rules in almost every case. This case study brings more questions than it does answers, but it does suggest that Canada no longer governs itself from a Weberian perspective, but has moved from government to governance in this respect. Follow the link in the description for the full case study.